Pleasant good day, everyone, wherever you are tuning into this video. We want to continue our conversation we started on culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy and de-streaming focus. And in our first video, we give an overview of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, but also looking at the culturally relevant and responsive educator. We want to build on that. But in building, we want to actually go back and very intentional that we did it this way. So we want to have a conversation today about disrupting and dismantling deficit thinking in our schools. And of course, we need to do this first or ensure this is being done while ensuring that we are ensuring that our pedagogy and our practice and our planning is culturally relevant and responsive. And that as educators, we are sitting in that space and we are operating from that space where we are intentional about disrupting deficit thinking, holding high expectations, using cultural responsive and relevant and material pedagogy and practices, and ensuring that we ourselves continuously remain in that space of reflective practice. It's as if I'm trying to find the words, but I'm not. I'm being intentional about the words I want to use, the words intentional, the words reflective, the words self, the words interrogate. Those are some of the words I want us to kind of anchor as we get into this kind of conversation. So one of the first things I like to ask is, when you think of the word disrupting deficit thinking, that whole phrase, what comes to mind? And what are some of those impacts? So in our conversation today, there's a few things I want us to examine. The first thing I want to examine is the factors associated with the persistence of low expectation and deficit mentality that is evidenced in many of our classrooms. And I think, as educators, after listening to my keynote, I hope you understand this is not an intention for you to say, well, I'm not doing anything and I feel like, I'm not doing anything. No, we know you're doing things. We know you're working. We have amazing educators. And I'm not saying that to make anybody feel better. I'm saying that because that is the truth. However, one of the things that I've noticed that I've allowed myself to grow is that I've been honest about tools that I have used, honest about pedagogies that I have used, honest about classroom practices that I have used and policies that I have realized over the years that they are no longer useful, or they were not as effective, or they did not include all students. And so we want to examine those factors. And as we're examining the factors, I want us to examine ourselves. Think about the tools you have been using, and if any of those tools could indeed be associated with the persistence of low expectations. The next thing we want us to do is continuing the self part, is ask ourselves and the system and the class and the school some critical questions about how deficit thinking is perpetuated in our school planning, in our sports, in our activities, in our productions, in the books we select, in the things we do, in the celebrations, in how we do our morning announcement, report card writing. Ask yourselves critically, what are some of the ways that deficit thinking is perpetuated? Because we act on them, right? We do act on those deficit thinking. We also want to look at the ways in which the deficit ideologies impact student identity. I remember a while back, I did a conversation and we talk about belonging in our school. And we look at the many indicators that said to students, you do not belong. And then we look at the many indicators that say to students, you belong. We have to remember, if our students do not feel a sense of belonging, if they do not feel safe in our classrooms, then the learning, the growth will be impacted. We want to also look at the common language that is evidenced in our school that further oppresses certain students. And then the most important thing, how do we move How do we improve? I didn't say get new now. Get it right. How do we improve our toolboxes to strength-based approaches and asset-based approaches? Because as I said before, I know we already have some amazing approaches. So I want to share with you just quickly 3 pictures. The first one I want to share with you, it's not taken from education, it's taken from the area of economics, but I love this picture. I want to share this cartoon with you. I want you to notice that there's an adult and a child. And sometimes we say parent and a child, but we don't know. So we say there's a grown-up and a child. And what they are facing, the cartoonist, you know, in examining this, and I read about it, what the cartoonist is showing you is that at the front, these are the persons who are being affected, and they are being affected by unemployment and hunger. But I want you to look in the back and you see power. The suits are a representation of power and privilege and access. The necktie, the suit, and the conversation there is deficit. So are we seeing our students or what they are going through or for what is happening, or are we blaming our students? You know, I remember years ago how we treated absence. In many spaces I've been, you know, a child would be absent almost every single, late almost every single day. And I said to myself, is this child late? Technically, yeah, but are we going to now put that pressure and that almost abusive tone to that student to say you're late again, knowing that that particular student may be dropping, you know, her 2 little brothers at the school up the road, and this is a time that she gets to school 10 minutes after the bell? Do we see that as late, or do we think about it as that is the accommodated time for her to arrive? We have to think how we further oppress. And that is what I want us to get, how sometimes our system, policies, and procedures further oppress. The next one we see is, I want you to take a look at the desks. So take a look at the desks and you see the individual students and what they are going through. But I also want you to see that sometimes we get the deficit, the stereotype, the assumptions, they get mixed in the real problem, because there are some real concerns here. Let us not get away from that. Don't think I'm going to get away from that. There are some real concerns, but the level of blame for our students is evident. And how do we add dadless to this dynamics? How is no books added to this dynamics? When is it that we blame a child because you have no dad? And so sometimes we have to look at how these happen, because the truth is, if we look and reflect in our spaces, we have seen where we have blamed our students and the families for certain things they have absolutely no control over. And we perpetuate that deficit thinking, right? So we have to ask ourselves, how are students defined? How are students labeled? And the next one is one of my favorite. And it's where we are honest. It's where we see our students coming to school. And of course, we know their backpacks is filled with books and crayons and all the amazing stuff. But the truth is, some of our students are coming to school with mental health issues, homelessness, poverty, trauma, access. You know, I have to take a minute to share something with you. A while ago, a couple of years ago, I had an aha moment when I realized that there were a number of students in my class that came from a shelter. So they lived in a shelter. So they would travel from the shelter to my classroom and back from my classroom to the shelter. It took me an intentional period of reflection to say to myself, how do I teach? How do I care for? How do I hold high expectation? How do I disrupt deficit thinking with a bunch of students that goes from a shelter to my classroom and back from my classroom back to a shelter? I have to realize that I have to be intentional about how I dealt with those students, how I was dealing with those students. I had to be intentional. And so, you know, one of the things that stares in the eyes and stares in our face is, it's easy for us to blame the students. You know, you're late. You know, you haven't done your homework. It's easy for us to do that. So deficit thinking is a common way of thinking which affects our general way of being in and constructing the world. You know, the differences from the norm are immediately seen as being deprived, negative, and disadvantaged. You know, how do I see those students? I saw them as students. I saw them as amazing. I saw them as full of dreams and possibilities. When we see them as that, even though they're coming from a shelter to my classroom, then my job is to figure out how do I maintain our expectations, hold our expectations, support our expectations, and disrupt systems within our schools and outside our schools as well, that is impacting their success. So differences are seen immediately. It never questions the legitimacy of what is deemed normal or does not consider the differences that may actually go beyond expected norms. This is the most powerful part. It discourages teachers and administrators from recognizing the positive values of certain abilities, disposition, and actions. You know, another quote from another quote here talks about, we see our students as a laundry list of problems. When we see our students as a laundry list of problems, we are then unable to look beyond students' more challenging behavior. Making meaningful and reciprocal relationships. And I want to anchor that word, I want to anchor that word relationships at this time. Because if we are going to disrupt deficit thinking, if we're going to disrupt anti-Black racism, if we're going to disrupt racism and Islamophobia and homophobia and all the things we talk about in our schools that are oppressive and inequity, if we're going to do that, I really want us to take a minute. I'm going to take my pen as well and circle the word relationships. Because that is how we build strong students. We have to engage in a positive relationship with our students. We have to see our students more than just numbers and a checkbox and someone coming to school. Get to know our students so we can build that great relationship and connect to their lived experiences and going back to our first conversation and ensuring that our pedagogy and our practice is culturally relevant and responsive. I'm going to keep going back to the other presentations as we connect this, because as we have to remember that the three tenets we talk about of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, the first one was holding high expectations. If we don't have relationships, if we don't see our students as possibilities, how are you going to hold high expectations? And so amazing thing I want us to do is to think about, are we focusing on, this is one of my favorite slide, are we focusing on fixing people? Think about this for a minute. And I leave these empty intentionally because as you're watching this video, I would love for you to think of ways that we fix our students, we try to fix our students. Think of those ways, traditional ways, dominant ways, I dare say colonized ways we are so used to. And ask ourselves, are those practices, are those ways culturally relevant? Are those ways responsive? But the most important thing I want us to look at is fixing the system. So we need to forget the first part for a minute. And I want us to focus on fixing the system. What would happen if we address the system? And I'm going to give you a perfect example of a school that I work with. And two things that they looked at about the system that they intentionally worked at. And I'm going to share one of that with you later on. So why do we dismantle? Why we need to dismantle? Deficit thinking. Number one, deficit thinking oversimplifies students' vast and heterogeneous experiences. Deficit thinking focus on students' perceived shortcomings, like we said, rather than their strength. She's late, she's late, she's late. All of a sudden, she becomes the late girl. And all the other strengths are overshadowed because of the deficit thinking, where she's late again, and now she becomes the late girl. And we have now don't even think we're going to use her for anything. We don't. She cannot be in the student council, or we're not going to put her in the school's dance. I mean, she's not going to be in the school's play. Sometimes I think we forget that sometimes when we act on our assumptions, it impacts everything else we offer to our students. And one of the popular ways that happens is, especially in ESL, there's so much conversations about when students are placed in ESL, is as if because you don't have Canadian English or you don't know Canadian English, it's almost as if we forget all the other amazing things that you actually do and actually know, because the ESL label kind of overshadow so many things. So we need to think about that. Deficit thinking focus on language that further oppress. We're going to talk about that. And deficit thinking undermines. So we're going to share 4 of those reasons. So the first one is deficit thinking oversimplifies students' vast and heterogeneous experiences. You know, our students do not come to school empty. Remember, they do not come to school empty. They come to school with cultural capital. That's a word I love to use. They come to school with cultural capital. They come to school with things in their knapsack, assets. How do we take what they have and use it? How do we take what they have, build on it, work with it, expand it, add to it, do all the things we need to do as educators with that to make them where they need to be? And so, you know, we need to think about that. You know, our students do have different experiences, and because of different experiences, it allows them to react to things different and to answer to things different. One of the things I want to underline is schema. I'm sure you know, everybody know that word, schema, prior experience. And I'm going to give an example that I went back to years ago as a young teacher. You know, you teach like you learn. So as a young teacher, September morning, you know, you remember those days when every single teacher would be giving students stories to write, and the story would be about, tell me about how you spent your summer. And I remember seeing students actually lying in their stories. Why they did that? Because somehow the messaging in the classroom, somehow the messaging in our schools were, where did you go for summer? Where did you travel for summer? What are the exciting things that you do that we consider to be worthy of summer? And so people would write that they went to Disneyland, they went to a cottage, you know, they went to the Coney Park, they went to Canada Wonderland. You know, if you're in Jamaica, you went to Duns River Fall. If you're in the Bahamas, where I used to teach, you went to the Atlantis. And students got the message very early that the only thing that really mattered were the important things that the teacher and the society considered to be how you spent your summer. So if you said you went by your grandmother in the country and you helped to pick coffee, or you did things and help her to take care of the animals, that wasn't essay worthy. And so we have to be careful at how we allow students to share who they are and share their lives and share their stories. Are we creating space for all our stories, for all our students and their lived experiences, and not just creating the space, but are we valuing that space? Not just creating the space, but are we valuing that space? The next one I want to run on to is deficit thinking focusing on students' perceived shortcomings. So, I like to show this picture. I've showed this picture a million times. I'm going to show it maybe another million. Is we have students who fail on arrival in our school. Fail on arrival. Because with these exams and tests and it's very standard and measured and very one-sided way of saying, tell me what you know. Many of our students fail. So one of the biggest things I'll ask you, I'll go back to culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, and I'll ask you as an educator, what are the different ways you're teaching? Are we teaching one way? Is everybody getting the same portion? Is everybody being addressed the same way? Are we taking in consideration universal design for learning? Are we taking in consideration differentiated learning? Are we taking in consideration accommodations? And accommodation is not a bad word. Accommodation is not a curse word. When we accommodate our students, we don't take away their dignity. Somehow you kind of feel in some spaces that the word accommodation is like, you know, you should be happy I'm trying to get you to do something. That is the kind of ideologies, that is the kind of intentions we need to disrupt. If I'm putting you on accommodation, if I'm accommodating you, I am working intentionally so I can make sure you are successful. That is what accommodation is. Right? So we have to think about how are we doing this to support, because we're talking about de-streaming. And I'm going to address this again in the next video. The idea that a lot of teachers kind of felt like, oh, if I de-stream, I can't teach. And when I heard, literally, when I heard, you know, somebody say, oh, everybody's in one room now, what am I going to do? You know, it really bothered me, because some of these are the very teachers who have made a name saying that they are inclusive, made a name saying that their classroom, you know, they reach all students, saying that, you know, their pedagogy is accommodating and liberating. And then it's not in practice. That is something that we have to be honest about. I know sometimes it seems harsh, but it's something we have to be honest about. Is your practice in alignment with the words you're speaking? Are you performing, or are you genuinely engaging our students? We have seen it happen in our schools, right? So we need to be honest about that. Deficit thinking focused on language that further oppress. And I'm going to give you one example, and I'll tell you how one school worked at it. One of the things that one school realized was the language in the report cards. An entire school I work with, the principal was really bothered by the language in the report cards. And of course, when it started, a lot of teachers was like, of course, they write perfect report cards. But when we sat down and we examined the report cards, and we look at some of the language, we took out the teacher's name and we gotta look at some of the language. We genuinely came to an aha moment. We genuinely came to a place of humility, a place of sensitivity. And we realized that some of this language in these report cards were just depressing. How do we say to our parents, we want to work with you so your child can do better, without saying to the parent, your child wasted an entire year in school? How do we work with that? How do we disrupt the system that is saying that? You know, one of the things that I personally did, this is not, maybe not for you, but one of the things I personally did when I started writing report cards and realized, you know, when I had students who were struggling, or students who had to accommodate more, I remember that I wrote way more next steps than description. So my next steps were a lot, in some cases, my next steps were a lot more than the comments, the regular comments. Why? Because I wanted to provide opportunities, suggestions, real suggestions to the parent to do over the summer, to do when you can, to inform them of ways we're going to work together next year, and to build hope and promise intentionally. And so ask yourself those things. And deficit thinking undermines. And instead, now what we want to do is to move from deficit thinking to strength-based approaches. And I'm going to use the example that I use. There are some strength, so instead of saying what is missing, and we focus on what is missing, I can't teach these kids because everybody's mixed up. Let's use the language that we use. Everybody's in the same grade and it's too much levels and I can't reach them. How do we intentionally think about what we do have? We do have strong students who are amazing to lead groups. We do have students who have different ways of doing. Are we using different ways of teaching? if we talk about universal design for learning, multiple ways of expressing, multiple ways of assessment, multiple ways of evaluation, multiple ways of doing, then what about our pedagogy? Do we have multiple ways of sharing, multiple ways of expanding and explaining and including? So let's focus on those asset-based, strength-based approaches. And some of those, that I shared, with one group is, the active listening, the language of hope, promoting student voice is a very big one. And sometimes we think promoting student voice means, well, let's hear it from the student. It's more than that. It's more than that. Have you ever built an assignment along with students? Have you ever thought about how you're going to create an assessment, but the student help you to decide on how you're going to create the assessment? Have you used some democratic principles and allow them to see democratic principles at work, where you come up with ideas and you kind of shortlist certain things and allow the class to vote on what you're going to do next? So they see on the board that out of the 40 or the 35 students, 20 voted for this. And you can bring in culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy into that conversation and ask about the rationale behind the vote and why people made certain choices. This is how you expand your students' voice. And of course, the differentiated instruction. So in closing this conversation, I want us to look at scenarios in our school. Take a minute to do that. Scenarios in your school that we consider can be deficit. One of those, as I said before, was the report cards and the strength-based approach. And in this particular school, they created alternative language, alternative sentences and phrases. They created an entire battery, an entire catalog, whatever you call it, database, whatever you call it, report card, comment database, comment battery of ideas that you can say and things you can say to express yourself, not in a pretentious way, in a very honest, intentional way. So the parents do understand that there are concerns, but the language does not further oppress. The language empowers. Strength-based. I remember one school I work with also, they were looking at the fact that they created this idea where the students would stay in at recess to do missing homework. And they realized quickly that this cannot be strength-based because they are missing recess. They are missing interaction. They're missing their playtime. They're missing the time when they discover their leadership and their personalities and characters. They're missing that student-student engagement outside the sitting down formal setting, which is intentional. Recess is not just a time for giving somebody a break. Recess is intentional. That's where students do their negotiating on the playground. That's where leadership is built. That's where solidarity is nurtured. And so one school realized we cannot do this. They decide this is a deficit way of getting them to complete homework, to strength-based approach. And so I want you in your own school system, in your own, teaching group, in your own grade level, in your own whatever you do to plan in different schools. I want you to be intentional about this. And I want us to even share some of this with me. I would be very happy to share some of these, submit them also, to your lead, submit them to the D-Streaming Focus lead. Answer some questions. Send us your comments. If you have a question, send us those questions so we can address them. I would be more than happy. If you send those questions in the next week or two, I'd be absolutely more than happy. This is a promise I'm making to create a special video, just a special video where I respond to some of these questions, but you have to send those questions in absolutely now. So let us do that and let us continue with this growth that we are intentional about here as we do this work of de-streaming, but also not just de-streaming, but sharpening our pedagogies and adding to our toolbox. culturally relevant and responsive pedagogies. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.